was a real blessing to be here together yesterday. And I want to, in my remarks, build on some of the topics that came up yesterday, particularly in the morning, kind of putting, remember Lande and Ravi and others talking about putting the human, putting people into the center. And I want to expand that a little bit towards putting relationships into the center. And then I really thought it was interesting last night, the space, kind of the topic of space and kind of the middle space, kind of the non-polarized. So space before polarization, or they can hold the tension, and the middle space, and what does it take to really kind of create these holding spaces that would allow us to be effective in these new environments we are now in. And so along the way, what I hope to also convey is to talk a little bit about the evolution of systems thinking and offer that as a sense-making tool for us, how we can make sense of all the stories and learnings that we are hearing kind of throughout all our conversations. So my own journey started here. I was born in Germany on a farm in northern Germany near Hamburg, and some almost 70 years ago, my parents, when they were young, decided to shift from conventional farming to regenerative farming, biodynamic farming. And that put them on a path of crop failures, lots of challenges. And as you know, kind of when you're on an innovator's journey, kind of before they celebrate you and give you awards and so on, there's a long period of being isolated, ostracized, ridiculed, and you know, anyone who swims against the stream knows that your old community becomes more distant, right? And that's what I experienced the first 10, 15 years of my life firsthand. But then also later when young people started to come onto the farm from all over, and that was a stream that hasn't ended until now, interested in that, kind of the energy shifted, right? And today, of course, they have been celebrated as pioneers and so on and so forth. But what was it that kept them going? So what I learned from that, if you really believe in something, 10 years of setbacks, well, you need to be ready for that, right? That's not too much. A decade or two of profound tests and challenges is what I saw that farm and my parents go through. And what kept them going was the commitment to the land, the commitment to the soil, the commitment to the well-being of all kind of the animals kind of on that farm. In the 1970s, the energy utilities, the big energy utilities in Germany, in their wisdom, decided to go for nuclear energy and built these plants across the country. There was a massive movement against it. I was part of that, one of the many, and one of the famous battlegrounds of that movement was not far from the farm, Brockdorf. And so it was, you know, for me, like a political awakening process. And that movement was massive and failed. A few years later, in the early 80s, it was kind of the peace movement. I became part of the, you know, basically mobilizing against the industrial military complex, kind of and that whole machinery from both sides of the divide. So I grew up in West Germany, but had also many collaborators and friends in East Germany and Eastern Europe, kind of in the civil rights movement and the peace movement over there. That movement also really didn't make much a dent. Kind of the, back then, kind of the all the plans of the cruise missiles and Pershings and so on, so were installed and went ahead anyway. However, a few years later, in an interesting turn of events, the Berlin Wall came down. And as we know today, that grassroots movement played a massive role in that. And I love, when you look at this picture, I love kind of, they bring these little tools, kind of a little hammer and so on, and kind of chipping away at the wall, or reaching out for each other, lending each other a hand. That's how real stuff happens, right? It's not big people doing big things. It's many, many small people doing many, many small things. And that's really, I was, at that time, leading with the founder of peace research as a science, Johann Galtung, who was very much inspired by Mahatma Gandhi and all his work. I was leading with him a peace studies around the world trip. I was a student activist, and it was kind of a 9-month study around the world. So we talked with the grassroots activists on both sides of the wall weeks, months before the wall came down, right? And there was no expectation. No one of that movement was aware of the massive changes they had been co-pioneering with other forces in that moment. So sometimes the impact is much bigger than is visible to the eye in the moment. During that trip, of course, we also came here for a month to Gujarat Vidyapeeth to study Gandhism in Ahmedabad with that group. So throughout all these experiences, what I realized is, okay, running against and mobilizing against the symptoms is one thing, but it was time for me to really understand and address the deeper root issues. So in my case, I picked economics. And when I published my PhD thesis with that title that no one can read, no one has ever read that, but Reflective Modernization, let me just read the title only, okay? Reflective Modernization of Capitalism as Revolution from Within. About that time, I had to realize my next shortcoming, which was that I was just another academic, right, who could talk a big deal about all the stuff that needs to happen, pointing at things, but I was really of no use for the real change makers in the field who were pushing these things forward. And then realization really moved me over to the MIT Learning Center in Boston, because that was just founded back then by Peter Senge, kind of as an integration of systems thinking, action learning, and action research. And so I was attracted by that because I hoped to learn to engage in a science that is a tool for positive change, that is actually helpful and can contribute something to the real change makers in the field, rather than more of this. So when you look at the current situation from the viewpoint of systems thinking, what do we see? We collectively create results that nobody wants. What kind of results? We see them in all the symptoms of the poly crisis. And I like to frame it kind of in these 3 divides. There's the ecological divide, the disconnect between self and nature. We just, as we all know, burned through the 1.5 degree ceiling last year. Yeah, I had my own little share on some of the failures. But in hindsight, I have to say that the story didn't end here with this failure. Many of these people in these pictures here went on and created the Green Party. 10 years later, in 1991, it was the Green Party that introduced the legislation of the energy feed-in tariffs in Germany, which really kickstarted the renewable energy industry. It was copied, replicated in 70 countries. And it allowed really investments to happen in renewable energy. And as we all know, for the past 10 years, investments in renewable energy have been outstripping investments in fossil fuel by an ever-increasing margin. So there's kind of little successes there as well, and the story never ends kind of with the what first is looking just as a failure. Then there's the social divide. It's basically polarization, inequity, war, violence, kind of everything that we talked about yesterday. And yes, I had my own share a little bit in some of the failings, some of the successes perhaps. But when we really look at what's going on today, what is it we are actually seeing? We see in this social space societies falling apart. Falling into groups that lost the capability to make sense together of what's going on and to respond together in regard to what's happening around us. And that phenomenon is nowhere more visible than back home in the United States. But of course, as we all know, it is a global phenomenon. However, the thing that really keeps me up at night is something else. Those two issues that I just mentioned, the writing has been on the wall for many, many years and decades. Not anyone who paid attention, to what's happening is not surprised about where we are now. What is a surprise for me and what personally irritates me most is this third thing. It has to do with something I call the spiritual divide. And it's really arising not from a disconnect self-nature or self-other, but a disconnect between self and self, between who I am today and who I could be tomorrow. It's manifesting in the pandemic of hopelessness, despair, and depression that we see going on around us. And the larger phenomenon that really is the one that irritates me so much is what can be called the illusion of insignificance. It's the feeling there's nothing we can do about those two other things, because anything I could do is completely insignificant relative to what is already unleashed. And I want to demonstrate that with two numbers that are coming out of the most recent UN Human Development Report, 69 and 68. 69% of people on this planet right now, according to these surveys, are willing to sacrifice part of their personal income to combat climate change. 69%. 68%, almost the same number, also say that they experience a complete loss of agency in terms of collective action, in terms of kind of what's actually happening in their communities and in their countries. So we have 69% of people with a positive individual intention, who want to make a difference, who are willing to sacrifice part of their personal income to combat these collective challenges. And almost the same number, 68%, say, but I have zero agency. I don't know how. That is the utmost, so that phenomenon, particularly when I meet that in young people, there's nothing we can do about this, is what's irritating me most. And I think kind of it's demonstrating because at the core, I'm an educator. I'm between education and movement making, you could say, kind of, and helping change processes to work all over. And that is the ultimate failure. If we don't, that's primary to the other two. Because if we don't make a dent there, we're not going to be successful on any of the other two. It's primary. If we believe there's nothing we can do about that, that's the end of the story. I am an educator, so kind of, yes, there are successes, but as Harish said yesterday, it's perhaps 1 out of 100, right? In reality, we are failing. So from a systems thinking perspective, when I arrived at MIT, that was the standard model here, right? Yes, you have symptoms, but then you have layers, process, structure, then the deeper patterns of thought. And I always thought, well, isn't there like yet a deeper level somehow? So that's what we now call source, the deeper sources of our creativity, of our energy, of our identity, of ourself, our sense of who we are and why we are here. And you could call that consciousness. I call it source. And of course, you also need a process somehow, kind of to move down to these deeper layers and get up into the tangible space. So that whole framework is what colleagues at the Presencing Institute and also Peter Senge and I and others refer to as deep systems change or awareness-based systems change. And I would summarize that real quick with 3 principles. You cannot change a system unless you transform consciousness. That's what I learned as an action researcher. If you don't like that, here's the McKinsey version of that same sentence. You cannot change a system unless you transform mindsets of the people who are enacting that system. Everyone knows that because we have seen it so often. The real question is not that. The real question is how? And this is what I learned. You can't transform consciousness unless you make a system see and sense itself. That's kind of our role as a leader, as an educator. And then 3, you can't do any of these things unless you sense, embody, and co-shape the emerging future. You need to feel the future. You need to, of course, Gandhi said that a long time ago, right? Be the change you want to see. So we need to feel it, and we need to also embody that, because if it's just kind of more of this, it will not make the cut. So in exploring this deeper dimension, I actually learned most of working with practitioners and listening to their experiences. And many of them talked, that's about a really, what you can only describe as a deeper dimension of systems leadership than the one that we usually hear about. And one of them, the late CEO of Hanover Insurance, summarized his experience of failing and succeeding in these processes of change with this sentence: the success of an intervention depends on the interior condition of the intervener. So the success of what I do depends on the inner place from that I operate. And when I heard that, I thought, wow, what is he really talking about? He's not only talking about what leaders, system leaders do and change makers, or how they do it, the process they apply. He's talking about a whole other dimension, the sources from which we operate, kind of the inner place from which we operate when we do what we do. And how do you even study that, right? I can put up a camera. How do I kind of capture the inner sources of some? So it was a real eye-opener to me to hear that. And today, I would map this territory in terms of these 3 inner instruments that we need to tune to be an effective change leader, and to be effective in situations and episodes of transformation. Open mind, open heart, open will, aka accessing our curiosity, our compassion, and our courage. In further exploring kind of this deeper dimension, I realized that there are two different sources of learning and leadership. One is basically the past, right? Kind of, the experiences of the past, you could say. And the other one is the emerging future. Basically, all the existing learning methodologies that we have, and also leadership methodologies, are based on reflecting on the experiences of the past. Yet, as we all know, when we deal with the unknown, right, and the unknown, we need to develop the capacity to be effective, to connect, to sense and realize emerging future possibilities. That's really the currency that counts the deeper we move into the age of disruption and systemic breakdowns. So how do you sense and realize emerging opportunities? How do you learn and lead from the emerging future? That was the organizing question, really, of my research for the past, as an action researcher, for the past 25 years. And what I found is this: what it takes is a journey that is both an outer journey and an inner journey. It's a journey that moves you through the three stages of observe, going to the edges of the system, and listening with paying attention with your mind and heart wide open. Secondly, retreat and reflect. Allow the inner knowing to emerge, kind of move to a place of stillness, kind of where you can connect to your deeper sources of knowing. And then when ideas begin to bubble up, you explore the future by doing. It's basically the design thinking and rapid cycle prototyping process. That is how 20 years ago, in the book Theory U, I, based on what I learned and heard, described this process. Today, I would summarize the same process with just 3 words: attention, intention, and agency. Attention, if truly deepened, gives rise to intention, so what it is that we are here for. Intention, if truly clarified and cultivated, begins to catalyze agency. And all of that, of course, kind of the core axis of this process is kind of this inner leadership work that I indicated. That's basically kind of in a nutshell, kind of the Theory U, kind of, or the deep systems change framework. And but what I really wanted to talk about today, kind of that's just the backdrop, is how this framework of systems thinking has been evolving in, contemplating the current moment that we are living through right now. This, as you know, all systems thinking, you have seen that many times, and also complexity theory. For the past 80 to 100 years, right, systems thinking, complexity theory have been using the iceberg model. And I always thought, okay, 100 years on, perhaps it's about time to come up with a new metaphor, right? That has been really useful, but perhaps there's something that is more relevant to the current moment we are in. And the source of inspiration for me is the farm that I grew up on. And if I learned anything from my father, it is this: that the quality of what's growing above the ground is a function of the quality of the soil, the quality of the roots. It's as simple as that. Kind of all the attention of the regenerative farmer is on the quality of the soil and the quality of the roots. Everyone knows that. if you work not on agricultural fields, but social fields, like I do, and I think like all of us do, then I would say the same thing applies. The quality of the results of any kind of social system are a function of the quality of the social soil, by which I mean the quality of our awareness and the quality of our relationships. So kind of the emerging topics that came up in various case stories yesterday. So if you apply that distinctions, right, between social systems, by which people usually refer to the tangible stuff, and the social soil in which these systems are grounded in, when, you know, and I think it's an experience many change makers have, which is in any story of transformation, what's most important is least visible to the eye. What's most important in transformation is least visible to the eye. What is it? It's this root stuff here. And so if we apply this simple distinction onto our current situation, what do we see? Okay, so we have all these sectors. There's a little cutoff there. At the top, you can just imagine the word business, okay? And then the quality of the soil, you know, one way of talking about it is that's really the operating system, right? It's kind of how it's the connections, the quality of connections, how all these elements kind of connect with each other. And having worked through all these sectors here, what I'm noticing is you see basically the same thing going on across all these different sectors, which is a shift from output and efficiency-centric to user and stakeholder-centric, and from there, another shift to yet another operating system, which is regeneration and ecosystem-centric. So to give a few examples, in agriculture and food, from industrial to regenerative. In education, teaching for testing to education for human flourishing. We are just launching multi-country initiative with the OECD kind of around this. How do we reimagine education in the age of AI, right? And kind of seeing the massive failure of our current education system. So that is kind of one way of framing it. Health, kind of from fighting symptoms of sickness towards strengthening sources of well-being and health. Sustainability in business, from resource efficiency to operating as a business as a force for good. Finance, from extractive to regenerative. In tech, yes, that would be a whole day in itself, but let's just say how to move from technologies that are awareness and creativity diminishing to those that are awareness and creativity enhancing. And all of that, of course, is grounded in governance at the end of the day, our traditional forms of governments, the crisis thereof, and how to move towards what I call awareness-based collective action, by which I really mean organizing around shared intentionality, right? Which is something we all do in all multi-stakeholder processes. That's kind of the real work we do in the field. So it may look complicated, but the logic is very simple. What I'm really saying here is something very simple, and it's this: that the evolution of our sectors, institutions, and systems can be seen as a manifestation of an evolving human consciousness that moves from ego to eco, that moves from silo and ecosystem awareness to user and multi-stakeholder awareness, and from there to regeneration and ecosystem awareness. And as we go through that shift, we see, and as we see this space of convergence here, and we all deal in all these sectors with the same topics: how to move from extraction to regeneration, from mindset shifts from silo to systems or ego to eco, and how to move our patterns of action from reacting against the past towards sensing and actualizing kind of emerging future possibilities. Now, if you work with institutions on these topics, this is what people say. We are trying to solve 4.0 challenges with 2.0 methods and tools. Kind of that's how our organizations are set up. That's the toolkits I got. We are being encouraged to shoot for the moon while some of us are still driving a donkey cart. UN resident coordinators, right? And so, in other words, there's a mismatch between the challenge that I experience in the field, right, which is here in this 4.0 space, and the 2.0 setup of our institutions, the tools that I have to address that challenge. That's the gap that we all feel. And why is it so difficult to move from here to here? And I would say it's so difficult because we are looking at it the wrong way. Because all the attention goes onto the top half. What we are missing is the lower half. And in my view, there is a functional equivalence between the soil, the soil of the planet that gives rise to the flourishing of the biosphere, as we all know, and human attention and human awareness that gives rise to the flourishing of the social sphere. And just as the farmer needs tools like the chisel plow to cultivate the land, the soil, we, as the farmers and gardeners of the social field, need practices and tools to cultivate that quality of relationship. And that's really kind of what what the next book is about. That will come, that will come out in a couple of months. But what we want to go more deeply into in the breakout session this afternoon. Let me just say kind of it has like both the personal, interpersonal skills like listening and dialogue, connecting to the future, and the more systemic related kind of dimensions and practices that we all know we need to bring together if we want to move the dial. So let me just give kind of one little illustration here. What does it really mean kind of becoming aware or shifting the quality of attention? When you take a stick and throw it in front of a dog. The dog is running after the stick. We know that. When you take the same stick and you throw it in front of a lion, what's going to happen? The lion is turning his head and looking straight at you. So how often in our organizations, in our societies, are we responding to disruption in the mode of the dog, jumping after the stick? And how often are we able to respond in the mode of the lion, turning the attention from the object to the source? And that's really, in essence, what systems thinking is and what all these practices are about. But then, of course, there is another story. There's unintended side effects of social media, mass disinformation, mass polarization, mass depression, that has contributed to the rise of autocracy, kakistocracy, kind of the rule of the worst, the least qualified, fragmentation and war, dystopian views that we are flooded with, hyper inequality, hyper extraction when you look at fracking, opioidization, education as tool for indoctrination, the all-present, omnipresent fragmentation of the soil and of our attention as the foundational issue, as it's manifesting here in the listening space with echo chambers, silencing and othering cancel cultures left and right. Are these 11 different problems, or are these 11 different faces of one and the same problem? And if so, what is actually that problem? And I would, So I would suggest the title for this, I'm not sure it's readable. So it says matrix of absencing. What I mean by that is it's a way of human a quality of human agency where not all of us is present, right? Where we are outsourcing basically significant parts that are frozen in our past patterns, but are unable to move forward. So that's what I would say is a little bit our current moment here that we are in between. So what I'm basically saying is something very simple. The systems leadership of tomorrow is about deepening our attention from social systems towards social soil, the quality of our awareness and relationships. And so, which means that if we want to really do all these things that we always say we want to do, there's only one way we will succeed, and that is by cultivating the social soil. You can say, well, that's a really trivial point, right? So what's new about that? Well, I would say that's exactly not what's happening today. Because usually what's happening today is, starting point is a gap, a deficit, a threat that we are mobilizing against. The strategies are based on a disconnect between means and ends. I'm blocking people to get to work, and that is helpful for mobilizing against climate change. And so Gandhi always said, the means we choose need to reveal the ends, right? There cannot be a disconnect. And then support structures, mostly informational. If this is true, when a system is far from equilibrium, small islands of coherence in a sea of chaos have the capacity to lift the entire system to a higher order. So if that is true, what might a different strategy look like? The starting point would be being grounded in aligning attention, intention, and agency. Kind of focusing our attention, right, on what it is that we want to bring in the world, rather than what it is we are just fighting against. Creating strategies that focus on the creation of islands of coherence that embody the future that you want to create through practices in kind of shifting the quality of relationships, and support structures that create kind of generative holding spaces that weave these islands of coherence to ecosystems of coherence. These generative holding places can happen in many different ways. Like here in Cambodia, kind of in high stakes negotiations between indigenous people on indigenous land with their counterparts in government and business, using dialogue, kind of and deep listening. They happen in new mapping methods that Manish will also kind of double click on in the deep dive in the afternoon. So basically so it's basically an accelerator how to move with polarized situations, stepping in all the kind of different roles, current reality, emerging future. They can happen in, bringing kind of change makers together on a country level, like around regenerative cultures in Colombia. They can happen in very traditional institutions, like kind of the UN country teams. We did that in over 30 countries with the UN country teams and humanitarian country teams, working on their key challenges. And so there will be like later kind of an example of that as well in more detail. It can happen in a day, kind of on a country level scale. It can happen over multiple years, like in this case, with grassroots change makers of 17 of the 19 Latin American countries, all grounded in local initiatives that I cannot go into here in detail. It happens on a cabinet level, like here with the newly inaugurated cabinet in Indonesia, and it can happen at scale. It can be scaled kind of in significant ways. So in closing, Systems leadership of tomorrow, I believe, is about extending the attention from social systems to social soil. And what that really means, is cultivating the social soil, which means moving beyond business as usual and focusing on creating islands of coherence, which then are woven together into ecosystems of coherence on a local level, on a regional level, and also on a planetary level. What in this is the failure story? Well, I thought the hard part was creating all these living examples, but I was wrong. Because what I learned since is that if you do this kind of social soil work, and all of us who kind of are engaged in that have experienced that, if you do that, you're basically in the blind spot of the current philanthropic funding paradigm, which is focusing on short-term, measurable outcome metrics that happen to be kind of on this social systems level. And yet, yes, we need that, but we also need the social soil. So I believe that a better balance between social systems and social soil is perhaps the most important leverage points for us as a sector, but also for us as a humanity to move forward and to connect with the remainder of the 90% of people around us who want to make a positive difference, but who don't know how. Thank you.